Can't even ride a horse. Professional jockey laughed at him but regretted it instantly. Matthew Johnson was shaking so badly he could barely hold the reins of the chestnut horse. At 18, he'd never ridden a horse before, but now he desperately needed to learn in just 3 weeks to compete in a race that could save his grandmother's life. That's when he heard the loud, mocking laugh behind him. He turned and saw Richard Parker, the most famous professional jockey in the region, arms crossed and a cruel smirk on his face. "Look at this, everyone," Richard shouted to those at the stables. "Grandma Grace's boy wants to be a rider, can't even get on the horse right, and already wants to race." Matthew's face burned with shame as others stopped to watch the humiliation. The chestnut horse, as if sensing his nervousness, began to fidget, nearly making him lose his balance. "You'll embarrass the whole Johnson family," Richard continued, circling Matthew like a predator. 10 years as a national champion, and I have to witness this joke." The reason that brought Matthew there was real and painful. His grandmother, Grace Johnson, was hospitalized in the neighboring town, fighting a serious illness that required urgent surgery. The treatment cost exactly the prize money from the traditional St. Peter's Stables charity race, held every year to help families in need. The problem was, according to the event's century-old rules, only direct descendants of the town's founding families could participate. The Johnsons were one of those families, but none of the men in the current generation knew how to ride. Matthew's father had passed away when he was a child, and his mother had always strictly forbidden him from going near horses. "My grandmother was the best rider this town has ever seen," Matthew said, trying to keep his voice steady. "She told me she won this race 3 times in a row." Richard let out another sarcastic laugh. "Grace was good, sure, but that was 40 years ago. You're just a town boy who works at your uncle's garage. She must be so ashamed now, watching her grandson make a fool of himself." The words cut deep into Matthew's heart. It was true. He'd worked as a mechanic at his uncle's auto shop since he was 15, right after his mother became a widow, and they needed money. He'd never had the time or chance to learn to ride, even though he lived in a town where equestrian tradition ran strong. St. Peter's Stables was on the outskirts of Greenfield, a small town in Kentucky, where old families still held onto their rural traditions. Matthew had grown up watching horses graze in the fields around town, but always from a distance, always forbidden by his mother to go near them. 3 weeks, Matthew muttered, more to himself. "I just need 3 weeks to learn the basics." 3 weeks? Richard nearly choked laughing. "Kid, I've been training since I was 5. I have 32 years of experience. You think you'll learn in 3 weeks what took me a lifetime to master?" Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now back to the story. Matthew carefully dismounted, his legs trembling. The horse, a calm chestnut named Thunder, looked at him with big, dark eyes, as if understanding his desperation. "Why are you doing this to me?" Matthew asked Richard directly. "I just want to help my grandmother." For a moment, Richard's expression shifted. Something flickered in his eyes, but the mocking smile quickly returned. "Because someone needs to teach you how the world works, kid. It's not just about wanting something to make it happen. You need talent, preparation, experience. You have none of that." What Matthew didn't know was that Richard had his own reasons for wanting to discourage him. The professional jockey was engaged to Helen Taylor, the daughter of the stable's owner and the official organizer of the charity race. Helen had always admired the Johnson family's story, especially Grandma Grace, and when she heard that Grace's grandson wanted to participate in the race, she was excited by the possibility. Richard knew that if Matthew actually managed to learn to ride and join the race, Helen would be even more enchanted by the young man's determination, and that was something the jockey couldn't allow. He had worked for years to win Helen over and secure a privileged position at the most important stables in the region. "Besides," Richard continued, walking over to his own horse, a purebred English stallion named Lightning, "you don't even have a horse. Thunder here is too tame for a race. He's a kid's horse for learning to ride, not for competition." Matthew looked at Thunder, who did seem calm and gentle compared to the other horses at the stables. He was an older animal, with some scars on his legs, clearly retired from racing. "Old Joe said I can train with him," Matthew replied, referring to the stable hand. "Old Joe just feels sorry for you, but he won't give you a racehorse. The good ones are all reserved for real competitors." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Helen Taylor. She was around 28, with brown hair tied in a ponytail, wearing riding boots and a light blue button-up shirt. Her face carried a mix of determination and kindness that earned her everyone's respect at the stables. "Richard, what's going on here?" she asked, sensing the tension in the air. "Nothing serious, love. Just talking to the young man here about how hard it is to learn to ride in such a short time." Helen looked at Matthew with renewed interest. "You're Grandma Grace's grandson, aren't you? I'm Helen. I heard you want to join the charity race." "Yes, ma'am. My grandmother needs surgery and, well, the race prize would be exactly what we need." "How wonderful," Helen said, genuinely moved. "Your grandmother was an inspiration to me when I was little. I always heard stories about how brave and elegant she was on horseback." Richard felt a tightness in his chest as he saw the sparkle in Helen's eyes. This was exactly what he feared. "Helen, you can't be serious," he interjected. "The kid's never ridden in his life. It'd be way too dangerous to let him race. He could get seriously hurt." "That's not what matters right now," Helen replied, keeping her eyes on Matthew. "What matters is that he wants to try, and the rules allow any descendant of the founding families to participate, regardless of experience." Matthew felt a wave of relief and gratitude. "Thank you, Miss Helen. I promise I'll train hard. I won't disgrace my grandmother's memory." "I'm sure you won't," Helen smiled, "and just call me Helen." Richard watched the exchange with growing irritation. He needed to do something to discourage Matthew, and he knew exactly what. "You do know you'll have to pass a skills test before the race, right?" he said to Matthew. "It's mandatory for all participants, especially inexperienced ones." Helen looked at him in surprise. "What test? I've never heard of that." "It's an old rule, love. It's in the regulations. All riders must demonstrate minimum competence before being allowed to race, for everyone's safety." Matthew's stomach sank. He had no idea if this was true or not, but the confidence in Richard's voice worried him. "When would this test be?" he asked. 2 weeks before the race. "In other words, you'd only have 1 week of training before proving you know what you're doing." Helen seemed confused but didn't question it. Richard was the professional jockey and knew all the rules and traditions better than anyone. "Then I'd better start training today," said Matthew, trying to keep determination in his voice. "So you can start," Richard laughed. "But I'll warn you, you won't make it. In a week, I'll be right here watching you humiliate yourself in front of everyone." Matthew climbed back onto Thunder, this time more carefully. The horse stood still, patiently waiting for the boy to get comfortable. It was unlike anything Matthew had ever experienced. From up there, the world seemed bigger, and at the same time, more frightening. "Let's go, Thunder," he whispered to the horse. "We're going to show this guy he's wrong." Over the next few days, Matthew established a strict routine. He woke at 5 in the morning, went to the stables to train for 2 hours before working at his uncle's shop, and returned in the late afternoon for 2 more hours of training. Old Joe, the caretaker, became his makeshift instructor, teaching him the basics of staying in the saddle, giving commands to the horse, and keeping his balance. "The boy's got a knack for it," Old Joe commented to Helen on the 3rd day of training. "Thunder likes him, that's a good sign." "Do you think he has a chance?" Helen asked, watching Matthew try to trot without falling. "A chance to win? I don't know, but a chance to compete without getting hurt. I think so." The kid's determined. Richard, who had been listening from a distance, decided it was time to step up his efforts to discourage Matthew. The next morning, when Matthew arrived for training, he found Thunder visibly agitated and nervous. "That's odd," murmured Old Joe. "Thunder's always so calm." What they didn't know was that Richard had woken up early and deliberately spooked the horse, making loud noises and sudden movements in the stable. When Matthew tried to mount, Thunder sidestepped and reared slightly, causing the boy to lose his balance and fall onto the dirt. "Ouch!" Matthew groaned, feeling a sharp pain in his right arm. Old Joe rushed to help him. "You all right, boy?" "I think so," Matthew said, getting up slowly. "Just scraped my arm." But the fall had shaken his confidence. For the first time, he felt real fear of the horse and the possibility of getting seriously hurt. Richard appeared minutes later, feigning surprise. "What happened here?" "Thunder was jumpy and the boy fell," old Joe explained. "See?" Richard said to Matthew. "And Thunder's the gentlest of them all. Imagine when you get on a real racehorse, you could break your neck." Matthew looked at Thunder, who now seemed back to normal, calm and docile. There was something strange about the whole situation, but he couldn't figure out what. "I'll try again," he said firmly. "You sure?" old Joe asked, concerned. "I am. My grandma can't wait." Over the next 2 weeks, strange things kept happening during Matthew's training. Thunder was sometimes agitated, sometimes fine. Other horses at the stables began making noises when he passed by. Once he found his riding gear tampered with and poorly adjusted. Richard always showed up after these incidents, offering discouraging remarks. "Seems even the horses know you shouldn't be here," he said after a particularly rough day when Matthew had fallen twice. "It can't just be coincidence," Matthew muttered to himself as he walked home, sore and frustrated. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing, Matthew Johnson's grandmother was getting worse. He visited the hospital every day after work and could see her growing weaker. The doctors had made it clear the surgery couldn't be delayed much longer. "How are the training sessions going, my grandson?" Grandma Grace asked during one of these visits. Even weak, her eyes still sparkled with the intelligence and determination that had made her famous in the region. "They're going well, Grandma." "Better every day," Matthew lied, not wanting to worry her with the difficulties. "You know I never told your mother why I forbade her from letting you learn to ride?" Matthew was surprised. This was a subject the family never discussed openly. "No, Grandma." "Why?" Grandma Grace took a deep breath, as if preparing to share something she'd kept hidden for a long time. "Your father. He didn't leave like your mother always said. He died in a horse-related accident. But it wasn't just any accident, Matthew. He was being trained by someone who wanted to see him fail." Matthew's heart raced. "What do you mean, Grandma?" "Your father, Carl Johnson, was a natural rider. Even without formal training, he had incredible talent. When he decided to enter the charity race, a professional jockey from the area didn't like the competition. He started sabotaging your father's training, agitating the horses, tampering with equipment." The revelation left Matthew speechless. The similarities to what was happening to him were impossible to ignore. "Who was that jockey, Grandma?" "A man named Robert Parker, father of the Richard who's competing now." Matthew's world seemed to spin. Richard Parker was the son of the man who had caused his father's tragedy. Your father discovered the sabotage and confronted Robert one night at the stables. There was a terrible argument, and in the chaos, your father fell from a horse and hit his head on a rock. Robert called it an accident, but I always knew there was more to it. Why didn't you ever tell me this before? Because I was afraid you'd want to avenge your father and end up hurt too. But now, seeing you try to enter the race, I realize Johnson blood is stronger than fear. Matthew left the hospital with his mind racing. Everything made sense now. Richard wasn't just being cruel to a beginner. He was repeating his father's pattern, sabotaging a Johnson who threatened his supremacy. Determined to confront Richard, Matthew returned to the stables the next morning earlier than usual. He found the professional jockey in the barn, fiddling with something near Thunder's stall. "What are you doing there?" Matthew asked. Richard turned, clearly caught off guard. "Nothing serious, just checking the horses." "Checking or sabotaging?" Richard's expression shifted, turning defensive. "What are you talking about?" "I know what your father did to mine 18 years ago, and I know you're doing the same to me." Richard paled briefly but quickly regained his composure. "I don't know what nonsense you're spouting. My grandmother told me everything. Robert Parker caused the fall that took my father, and now you're trying to do the same to me. Your father was an incompetent who got hurt because he couldn't ride properly," Richard snapped, his civility finally slipping. "And you'll follow the same path if you don't quit now." "I won't quit, and I'll prove you're sabotaging my training." "Prove it then," Richard challenged. "But remember, you have less than a week before your aptitude test, and I'll be there to watch you humiliate yourself." From that day on, Matthew changed his strategy. Instead of training alone with old Joe, He convinced Helen to join some of his sessions. With her there, Richard couldn't pull his usual sabotage. "You're improving a lot," Helen remarked, after watching Matthew trot and canter with Thunder for half an hour without falling. "Are you sure you've never ridden before?" "I'm sure. But I think it runs in the family. Your grandmother always said horseback riding isn't just about technique. It's a conversation between two souls. You seem to understand that intuitively." Richard, who was watching from a distance, grew increasingly annoyed with Matthew's progress. He decided it was time to take more drastic measures. That night, after everyone had left, Richard returned to the stables with a plan. He knew the aptitude test would take place the next morning, and he needed to ensure Matthew failed spectacularly. He found Thunder in the stable and began putting his plan into action. Using techniques he'd learned for training difficult horses, he spent 2 hours frightening and agitating the animal, creating negative associations with anything that reminded him of Matthew's training. "Tomorrow, you'll show everyone what kind of rider that boy really is," Richard murmured to Thunder, who was visibly stressed. On the morning of the aptitude test, Matthew woke earlier than usual, feeling a mix of nerves and determination. He knew this day would decide whether he'd have a chance to help his grandmother or if he'd have to find another way to get the money for her surgery. When he arrived at the stables, a small crowd had gathered. Besides Helen and Richard, Old Joe, a few other stable workers, and 3 members of the race organizing committee were there, including Helen's father, Dr. Taylor. "Good morning, Matthew," Helen greeted him. "Are you ready?" "I think so," he replied, though his voice betrayed his nerves. "The test is simple," Dr. Taylor explained. "You need to show you can control the horse at a walk, trot, and canter, make some basic turns, and prove you can stop when needed. Nothing too complicated." Matthew nodded and headed to the stable to get Thunder. But when he arrived, he immediately sensed something was wrong. The horse was restless, snorting and shifting nervously. "That's odd," Old Joe muttered. "Thunder was fine last night when I did my rounds." Richard approached with a smile that couldn't hide his satisfaction. "Looks like Thunder's feeling the pressure too," he commented. "Animals are very sensitive to their owner's nerves." Matthew tried to calm Thunder, speaking softly and stroking the horse's muzzle as he'd learned. For a moment it seemed to work, but as soon as he tried to put on the saddle, the horse grew agitated again. "Maybe we should postpone the test," Helen suggested, concerned. "No," Matthew said firmly. "I can do this." With great care and patience, he managed to saddle Thunder and mount him. The horse was trembling, clearly unsettled, but Matthew stayed calm and steady. "You can begin whenever you're ready," Dr. Taylor said. Matthew took a deep breath and signaled Thunder to start walking. The horse obeyed, but his movements were erratic and nervous. When Matthew tried to pick up the pace to a trot, Thunder suddenly reared and sidestepped. Matthew stayed in the saddle, but the maneuver was uncontrolled and dangerous. Concerned murmurs rose from the onlookers. "Keep going," Richard called. "Show us you can handle the animal." Determined not to give up, Matthew tried again. This time he managed to get Thunder to trot a few yards, but when he attempted a simple turn, the horse refused to obey and bolted straight toward the fence. Matthew yanked the reins hard, barely avoiding a collision, but the move was clearly amateurish and desperate. "This is too dangerous," one committee member said. "The boy's going to get hurt." "Just a little longer," Matthew pleaded, sweating. "I can do this." But when he tried to make Thunder gallop, the horse simply stopped obeying altogether. It began jumping and shaking, trying to throw off the rider. Matthew fought to stay in the saddle, but after what felt like an eternity, he was thrown hard to the ground. He landed on his back, his left shoulder hitting the hard earth. "Matthew!" Helen shouted, running toward him. The young man got up slowly, clearly hurt and humiliated. Thunder had calmed instantly, as if all the agitation had vanished in an instant. "Well," Dr. Taylor said regretfully, "I think that answers our questions. I'm sorry, son, but I can't authorize your participation in the race. It would be irresponsible of me." "Please," Matthew begged, ignoring the pain in his shoulder, "give me one more chance. Thunder has never acted like this before." "The decision is final," said another committee member. "We're sorry about your grandmother, but your safety is more important." Richard walked up to Matthew with a fake smile. "I warned you, kid. Riding isn't for everyone. At least you tried. Matthew looked at Richard, then at Thunder, who was now completely calm and docile. Something about the horse's behavior didn't make sense. It was as if he had returned to his usual gentle, obedient self. "Something's not right here," Matthew muttered. "The only thing not right is you thinking you could become a rider in 3 weeks," Richard shot back. Helen approached Matthew with genuine concern. "I'm so sorry, Matthew. I really thought you could do it." "So did I," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. As everyone dispersed, Matthew stayed alone at the stables with Thunder. The horse walked up to him and nuzzled his arm as if apologizing. "It wasn't your fault, boy," Matthew whispered, stroking the animal. "Someone made you act like that. I know it." That afternoon, Matthew visited his grandmother at the hospital with a heavy heart. He knew he'd have to tell her about failing the test and not being able to compete in the race. "How did the test go, grandson?" Grandma Grace asked as soon as he walked into the room. Matthew tried to stay composed, but he couldn't. Tears began streaming down his face. "I couldn't do it, Grandma. I failed the test. I won't be able to race." Grandma Grace reached out and held his hand. "Tell me what happened." Matthew recounted the entire test, from Thunder's strange behavior to his humiliating fall in front of everyone. "And you're sure Richard was sabotaging your training?" "I am, but I can't prove it. And now it doesn't matter. They won't let me compete." Grandma Grace stayed silent for a moment, thinking. "Matthew, I never told you about Hope." "Who's Hope?" "She was my mare, the one I won the 3 charity races with. She's still alive, living on a farm nearby with an old friend of mine." "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because maybe it's not the end of the story yet. The race rules mention an aptitude test, but there's an old exception. If a rider can tame and ride Hope, they can compete regardless of the test." Matthew's heart raced. "But why would that be different?" "Because Hope isn't an ordinary horse. After I stopped competing, she became difficult. No rider has been able to mount her in the last 15 years. She rejects everyone. And you think I could do it? I don't know. But I know if anyone from the Johnson family can, the old rules allow them to race without the aptitude test." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. The next morning, Matthew woke up with a new spark of hope. His grandmother had given him the address of the farm where Hope was living, along with the phone number of Mrs. Edith, the old friend who was taking care of the mare. The farm was about 30 kilometers from Greenfield, down a dirt road that wound through hills covered in pastures. Matthew borrowed his uncle's motorcycle and set off early before he could change his mind. Mrs. Edith was a woman with white hair and piercing blue eyes, probably around 70 years old. She greeted Matthew on the porch of a simple but well-kept house, surrounded by a colorful garden. "So you're Grace's grandson," she said, studying his face. "You have her eyes. Did you know my grandmother a long time ago?" "I did. We were rivals in our youth, competing in every race in the region. But later, we became great friends. She was the one who asked me to take care of Hope when she stopped competing. She told me Hope is difficult." Mrs. Edith let out a dry laugh. "Difficult is an understatement. That mare has a mind of her own. Since she got here, she's never let anyone ride her. Not even me, and I take care of her every day. Can I see her?" "You can. But I'll warn you, you're going to be disappointed." They walked to a pasture at the back of the property where a white mare grazed alone. Hope was a majestic animal, elegantly built, but Matthew could see from the scars on her legs and the way she moved that age had taken its toll. "How old is she?" 23. For a horse, that's pretty old. But she's still strong and healthy." When Hope noticed their presence, she lifted her head and watched them carefully. There was something in the animal's eyes that Matthew couldn't quite decipher, a mix of intelligence and wariness. "Can I get closer?" "You can try, but she doesn't like strangers." Matthew approached slowly, speaking softly. Hope watched him, but didn't move away. When he reached out his hand, she sniffed his fingers cautiously. "That's more than she usually does," Mrs. Edith remarked, surprised. She usually backs off before anyone gets this close. Can I try to ride her? Without a saddle, without a bridle, without anything. You'll fall before you even get on. My grandmother said if I can ride her, I can enter the race even without passing the test. Mrs. Edith looked at him with a mix of admiration and concern. Your grandmother was always brave, but this is crazy. Hope could hurt you badly. I have to try. It's my only chance to help my grandmother. After much hesitation, Mrs. Edith agreed but insisted on staying nearby to intervene if necessary. Matthew stepped into the pasture slowly, trying not to make sudden movements. Hope watched him but stayed still. When he reached her side, the mare turned her head and looked him straight in the eyes. "Hi, Hope," he said quietly. "I'm Grace's grandson. She told me a lot about you." The animal tilted her head slightly, as if listening. "I know you don't like strangers, but I need your help. My grandmother is sick and I need to enter a race to get money for her surgery." Matthew kept talking, telling Hope about his grandmother, about training with Thunder, about Richard's sabotage. For some reason, he felt like the mare was really listening. After a few minutes, he tried placing his hand on Hope's back. She allowed it, but stayed tense. Encouraged, Matthew tried to take a step toward mounting her. Hope abruptly moved away, shaking her head. "Easy," Matthew said. "I won't hurt you." He tried again, and again Hope stepped back. This repeated several times until Matthew started to feel discouraged. "It's not working," he said to Mrs. Edith. "Maybe it's better to give up for today. Hope might need time to get used to you." But Matthew knew he didn't have time. The race was in a week, and his grandmother's surgery couldn't wait much longer. "Hope," he said, looking straight into the mare's eyes. "My grandma told me you two were partners, that you had a special connection. She's suffering now, and I'm the only one who can help her. But I can only do that if you let me." Something shifted in Hope's eyes. She stepped closer to Matthew and pressed her muzzle against his chest as if sensing his heart. "She's recognizing you," whispered Mrs. Edith. "I've never seen anything like it." Encouraged, Matthew tried again to place his hand on Hope's back. This time, she didn't pull away. Slowly, he attempted to push himself up onto the horse. Hope allowed him to mount, but as soon as he settled on her back, she began to move. It wasn't an aggressive motion or an attempt to throw him off, but rather as if she were testing his balance and determination. "Hold on tight," Mrs. Edith called out. Matthew gripped Hope's mane, trying to find his balance without a saddle or stirrups. The mare picked up the pace, moving from a walk to a trot. It was completely different from riding Thunder. Hope was powerful, her movements precise and elegant. Matthew could feel the animal's strength beneath him, but he also sensed she was holding back, not using her full capacity. After what felt like hours, but was only a few minutes, Hope finally stopped. Matthew was still on her back, breathless but smiling. "I can't believe it," said Mrs. Edith. "She let you ride her." "She's amazing," Matthew replied, stroking Hope's neck. "You know what this means, don't you? If you can ride Hope in front of the organizing committee, they'll have to let you race." Matthew's heart raced at the possibility. "Do you think she'd come with me to the stables?" "I don't know. Hope hasn't left this farm in 15 years, but maybe, if it's for your grandmother." Matthew spent the rest of the day at the farm, riding Hope several times and trying to build a connection with her. The mare seemed to have accepted him, but there was still a reserve in her behavior. As the sun began to set, Mrs. Edith invited him to dinner. "Your grandmother called me earlier," she said as they served the food. "She told me you failed the test yesterday." "It's true. It was humiliating. She also told me about your suspicions regarding Richard Parker. I'm sure he's sabotaging my training, but I can't prove it." Mrs. Edith fell silent for a moment, stirring her food. "I knew his father, Robert Parker." Matthew looked up, intrigued. "You did?" "Robert was an ambitious, unscrupulous man. He'd do anything to win. Your grandmother and I always suspected he caused your father's accident on purpose, but you could never prove it." "No. Robert was clever. He never left evidence. But once I saw him do something that stayed with me forever." "What?" "It was at a regional competition about 20 years ago. There was a young, talented rider who threatened Robert's dominance. The night before the race, I saw Robert in the stable tampering with the boy's equipment. And you didn't report it? I tried, but Robert had influence, and I was just a woman at a time when our word didn't carry much weight in that world. The boy fell during the race and broke his leg. He never competed again. Matthew felt a surge of anger, and now his son is doing the same thing. It seems so, but this time, you have an advantage the others didn't. What? Hope. If she truly decides to help you, no sabotage in the world will stop you. That night, Matthew slept at Mrs. Edith's farm, in a simple but comfortable room. His dreams were filled with images of running horses, his grandmother smiling, and Richard with his cruel expression. He woke before dawn and went to the pasture to see Hope. The mare greeted him with a soft whinny, as if she had been waiting for him. "Good morning, girl," he said, stroking her neck. "Do you want to come with me today to show everyone how special you are?" Hope looked at him with those intelligent eyes, and Matthew had the strange feeling she understood exactly what he was proposing. Mrs. Edith appeared with 2 cups of coffee. "So you've really decided to take her to the stables?" "I have, it's my only chance. Then I'll go with you. Hope will only accept it if I'm there." They loaded Hope into a trailer borrowed from a neighbor and set off for Greenfield. The whole way, Matthew felt a mix of hope and nervousness. He knew this day would define his future and his grandmother's. When they arrived at St. Peter Stables, they found Helen talking with some staff. She was surprised to see Matthew stepping out of the truck. "Matthew, what are you doing here?" "I came to prove I can race." "But you failed the test yesterday." "I know, but there's an exception in the old rules. If I can ride Hope, I can compete regardless of the test." Helen looked confused. "Hope? What mare is that?" "My grandmother's mare, the same one she won 3 charity races in a row with." At that moment, Mrs. Edith opened the trailer, and Hope stepped out slowly, cautiously observing the new surroundings. She was visibly tense but not aggressive. "My goodness," Helen murmured. "She's beautiful." "And untamable," Mrs. Edith added. "No rider has been able to mount her in the last 15 years. Several stable workers gathered to see the famous mare. Old Joe was among them, his eyes lighting up as he recognized the animal. "Hope!" he exclaimed. "I haven't seen her since I was young. What a magnificent mare!" The commotion caught Richard's attention, and he appeared from the stables. When he saw Hope, his expression shifted to a mix of surprise and irritation. "What's going on here?" he asked. "Matthew brought his grandmother's mare," Helen explained. "Apparently there's an old rule that allows entry if he can ride her." Richard let out a sarcastic laugh. "This mare, she must be 20 years old or more, and everyone knows she's impossible to ride." "That's exactly why the rule exists," Mrs. Edith said, clearly disliking Richard. "If someone can ride her, it shows a special skill." "This is ridiculous," Richard protested. "The kid can barely handle a calm horse, and now he wants to try with this stubborn old mare." Matthew ignored Richard's comments and approached Hope. The mare was clearly uncomfortable in the new environment, surrounded by strangers. "Easy, girl," he whispered. "I know this place is different from the farm, but we need to show these people what we can do." Helen watched the interaction with growing curiosity. "Have you ridden her before?" "Yesterday at Mrs. Edith's farm." "And she let you?" "She did. After a while, she accepted me." Richard crossed his arms, clearly skeptical. "One thing is riding at a quiet farm. Another is riding here with everyone watching. Old mares are even more sensitive to pressure." The comment was true, and Matthew knew it. Hope was visibly more tense than she had been at the farm. Her ears twitched constantly, picking up every sound around her. "I need everyone to step back a little," Matthew requested. "She needs to calm down first." Helen signaled for the people to step back, creating a wider circle around Matthew and Hope. The young man began speaking softly to the mare, using the same tone he had used at the farm. "I know this place is scary," he said, "but my grandmother used to come here. This place has her energy. You remember, don't you?" Hope lowered her head and sniffed the ground, as if truly searching for familiar signs. Gradually, her posture became less tense. Encouraged, Matthew placed his hand on her neck and began to stroke her. Hope leaned into him, a sign that she was starting to trust. "Incredible," murmured Helen. "She really likes him." "Liking him doesn't mean she'll let him ride," observed Richard, but his voice carried less certainty than before. Matthew continued talking to Hope for a few minutes until he felt she was calm enough. Then, slowly, he placed his hands on her back. The mare stood still, allowing his touch. Matthew took a deep breath and tried to push himself up. Hope took a few steps to the side, but didn't try to throw him off. It was as if she was testing whether he was really sure of what he was doing. "Come on, Hope," whispered Matthew. "For my grandmother, for Grace." At the sound of her old partner's name, Hope stopped moving. Matthew seized the moment and managed to settle onto her back. A murmur of admiration came from the crowd. Even Richard seemed impressed, though he tried to hide it. "It's not over yet," he said. "Staying on is one thing. Getting her to obey commands is another." Matthew knew Richard was right. Mounting was just the first step. He needed to show he could control Hope and guide her through the basic movements required for a race. "Let's take it slow," he murmured to the mare. "Just a calm ride to show them." Hope began to walk, her movements hesitant at first, but gradually growing more confident. Matthew guided her in a wide circle around the space, maintaining a steady pace. "Now let's try a trot," he said, applying gentle pressure with his legs. To everyone's surprise, Hope obeyed immediately, transitioning into an elegant trot that showcased all her experience as a competition mare. "My goodness," whispered old Joe. "She's remembering the old days." Matthew felt the change in Hope's movement. It was as if the mare had awakened from a long sleep, her muscle memory returning in full force. Encouraged by their success, he decided to try a light canter. Hope responded instantly, her hooves moving in perfect rhythm, making Matthew's heart race with excitement. They cantered a few yards before he gradually brought her back to a stop. Hope was panting, but her eyes shone with a vitality they hadn't shown in years. "Unbelievable," said Helen, clearly moved. "She seems to have turned back time." Matthew dismounted and stroked Hope's neck. "Thank you, girl. You were perfect." Mrs. Edith approached with tears in her eyes. "Your grandmother would be so proud. Hope hasn't allowed this with anyone since she stopped competing." Helen turned to the other members of the organizing committee who had arrived during the demonstration. "Well, gentlemen, it seems we have our answer. By the traditional rules, Matthew Johnson is qualified to participate in the charity race." Richard made one last objection. "But the mare is too old. It could be dangerous for her to run in a real race." "That decision lies with the rider and the owner," replied Dr. Taylor, who had observed the entire demonstration. "And by the standards we just witnessed, the mare is still in excellent shape." "Besides," added Mrs. Edith, "if Hope doesn't want to race, she simply won't. It's always been that way with her." Richard realized he had lost that battle but wasn't ready to give up completely. If Matthew was going to participate in the race, he'd need to find other ways to secure his own victory. "Well," he said with a forced smile, "it'll be interesting to see how they do in a real race. Competing is very different from a demonstration." "I'm sure they'll do just fine," replied Helen, giving Richard a meaningful look. In the following days, Matthew settled into a new training routine. Hope stayed temporarily at St. Peter's Stables, in a special stall prepared by old Joe. The mare seemed rejuvenated by the prospect of racing again. "She's eating better than she has in years," Mrs. Edith told Matthew, "and look how her eyes shine now." It was true. Hope displayed an energy that surprised everyone. During training, she showed flashes of her former greatness, moving with the elegance and speed that had made her famous decades ago. Matthew also felt he was improving quickly. Riding Hope was completely different from riding Thunder. The mare was responsive, intelligent, and seemed to anticipate his commands. "You two make an interesting pair," Helen remarked, watching one of their training sessions. "It's like she's teaching you." "Sometimes it really feels that way," admitted Matthew. "Like she knows exactly what to do and is guiding me." Richard watched the training from a distance, his irritation growing each day. He'd tried to approach Hope several times, but the mare completely rejected him, growing restless whenever he came near. "That mare hates me," he muttered to himself after yet another failed attempt. What Richard didn't know was that Hope had an excellent memory. She remembered Robert Parker perfectly, and all the times he'd tried to sabotage her old partner, Grace. Richard's scent and energy were too similar to his father's, and it triggered all the mare's protective instincts. The charity race was scheduled for Saturday morning, just 3 days after Matthew's qualification. The news that the legendary Hope was returning to competition spread quickly through the region, drawing far more attention than the race usually received. People from several nearby towns are coming to watch, Helen told Matthew. Hope is a legend around here. Won't that make her nervous? I don't know. She always loved an audience. She was quite the show-off in her prime. On Thursday evening, Matthew visited his grandmother at the hospital to update her on the latest developments. Grandma Grace was weaker, but her eyes lit up when she heard Hope was racing again. How is she? She asked eagerly. Amazing, Grandma. It's like she's turned back time. When she gallops, you can see why you two won so many races together. Hope was always special. She didn't race for prizes or glory. She raced for love, for the pure joy of flying across the fields. Do you think we have a chance to win? Grandma Grace squeezed Matthew's hand tightly. I don't know if you'll win, my boy, but I know you'll give it your all. And sometimes that's more important than victory. On Friday, the day before the race, Matthew arrived at the stables earlier than usual for one last training session with Hope. He found the mare restless in her stall, clearly bothered by something. What's wrong, girl? He asked, trying to soothe her. Old Joe appeared with a worried expression. She's been like this since early morning. I don't know what happened. Matthew examined Hope carefully, but found no injuries or signs of illness. It was as if she was just unsettled. I'll take her for a walk to see if she calms down, Matthew decided. But when he tried to saddle her, Hope refused to cooperate, dodging every time he approached with the gear. This is strange, Old Joe murmured. She's never refused the saddle before. That's when Matthew noticed something different about the saddle. One of the buckles was slightly loose, and the padding seemed tampered with. Someone messed with the saddle, he said, feeling a wave of anger. Are you sure? Absolutely. Last night everything was fine. Someone came here and sabotaged the equipment. Old Joe examined the saddle more closely. You're right. This buckle was deliberately loosened. If you had ridden like this, the saddle would have slipped during the gallop. Richard, Matthew said without a shadow of doubt. We can't prove it. We don't need to prove it. We just need to be prepared. They spent the entire morning checking and rechecking all of Hope's equipment. They found 2 more subtle acts of sabotage, a rein with an almost imperceptible cut, and a stirrup with a loosened strap. He's clever, Old Joe admitted. If you hadn't noticed, any of these things could have caused an accident during the race. But we noticed, and now we'll be ready for anything. On Friday afternoon, Helen held a final meeting with all the race participants. Besides Matthew and Richard, there were 5 other local riders, all more experienced than Matthew, but none with Richard's winning record. The race will be a 5-kilometer course, Helen explained. 2 full laps around the stables, passing through the fields and the forest trail. The prize for the winner is $50,000. Matthew's stomach twisted when he heard the amount. It was exactly what he needed for his grandmother's surgery. Any questions? Helen continued. One of the riders raised his hand. I heard the kid here is racing with Grandma Grace's mare. Isn't she too old for a race this long? Hope is 23, Matthew replied, but the vet checked her and said she's in excellent shape for her age. As long as she feels like running, another rider added. Everyone knows Hope always does what she wants. Richard, who had stayed quiet until then, finally spoke. It'll be interesting to see if a retired mare and an amateur rider can compete with professionals, but I admire the courage to try. There was something in Richard's tone that put Matthew on edge. It wasn't just arrogance, it was overconfidence, as if he knew something the others didn't. After the meeting, Matthew stayed behind to talk to Helen privately. Can I ask you a personal question? Of course. How well do you know Richard? How long have you been engaged? Helen seemed surprised by the question. 2 years? Why? It's just, he seems very confident he'll win tomorrow. Richard has always been confident. He's one of the best jockeys in the region. Have you ever noticed anything odd about his behavior? especially when it comes to competitions. Helen studied him carefully. "Why are you asking this?" Matthew hesitated, knowing his next words could change everything. "Because I think he's been sabotaging my training. And this morning, we found evidence that he tampered with Hope's gear." Helen's expression shifted completely. "Are you sure about this?" "I am. Old Joe can confirm it. Someone deliberately loosened several parts of the saddle and harness." Helen fell silent for a long moment, processing the information. "If this is true, it's very serious. Sabotage is grounds for immediate disqualification." "I know, but I can't prove it was him. I'll talk to my father about this. Maybe we can take some extra precautions tomorrow." "Thank you. I just want a fair competition." That night, Matthew had trouble sleeping. His mind raced between the anticipation of the race, worry over his grandmother's health, and the certainty that Richard would try something to stop him from winning. By 5 o'clock on Saturday morning, he gave up on sleep and headed to the stables. He found Hope awake and alert, as if she too were anxious about the day ahead. "Good morning, girl," he said softly. "Today's the big day." Hope stepped closer and nuzzled his chest, a gesture Matthew had learned to interpret as affection and trust. Old Joe arrived shortly after, carrying the equipment they had meticulously checked the day before. "Sleep well?" he asked with a smile. "Not really," Matthew admitted. "And you?" "Not much either, but that's normal before a big race. Your grandma called me last night to wish us luck." "How is she?" "Weak, but in good spirits. She said she'll be watching on her phone. Helen set up a live stream for the hospital." The thought of his grandmother watching the race gave Matthew extra motivation. He couldn't let her down. By 7 in the morning, the first spectators began arriving at the stables. Helen had estimated maybe 100 people, but it was already clear the crowd would be much larger. "Looks like half the county came to watch," remarked Mrs. Edith, who had come to support Hope. "Everyone wants to see the legend run again," said Helen, who seemed a bit overwhelmed by the event's logistics. By 8:30, final preparations were underway. Matthew carefully saddled Hope, checking every buckle and seam. The mare was calm but alert, clearly sensing the day's energy. Richard arrived riding Lightning, his English thoroughbred. The horse was impressive, much smaller than Hope, but visibly younger and more muscular. "Ready for the race of your life?" Richard asked Matthew with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "More than ever," Matthew replied. "Good, because this'll be the last time you compete. After today, you'll understand riding isn't for amateurs." There was a veiled threat in Richard's words that put Matthew even more on edge. At exactly 9 o'clock, all riders lined up at the starting point. The crowd had grown to over 300 people, including news crews from nearby towns. Dr. Taylor took on the role of race official. "Riders, prepare yourselves. The race will consist of 2 laps, each 2.5 kilometers long. The first to cross the finish line after completing the course will be the winner." Matthew looked at Hope, her ears pricked, clearly focused. It was as if all her years of retirement had been forgotten, and she was once again the champion who had dominated these races decades ago. "Let's show them, girl," he whispered. "Riders, take your positions." Silence fell over the crowd. Matthew's heart pounded so loudly he was sure everyone could hear it. "On your marks." Hope tensed her muscles, ready to spring. "Go!" The starting shot rang out, and 8 horses surged forward in a burst of dirt and speed. The race that would decide Matthew and his grandmother's future had begun. In the first few meters, Hope lagged slightly, as if assessing the situation. For a moment, Matthew panicked, thinking she had changed her mind about competing. "Come on, Hope!" he shouted, applying gentle pressure with his legs. As if obeying a long-forgotten command, Hope shot forward with a speed that stunned everyone watching. In a matter of seconds, she had overtaken 3 riders and was running side by side with Richard. "Impressive!" shouted the makeshift announcer Helen had managed to get for the race. "Hope is running like she's a 5-year-old mare." The crowd erupted in applause and cheers of encouragement. Matthew could hear people shouting his grandmother's name and Hope's, reviving memories of past races. Richard glanced to the side and saw Matthew and Hope running beside him. His look of surprise quickly turned into fierce determination. He hadn't worked this hard to let an amateur beat him. The first kilometre of the course was a long, straight stretch through the fields of the stables. Hope maintained a steady pace, neither too fast nor too slow, as if she knew exactly how to manage her energy. "She's running smart," Mrs. Edith observed to Helen. "She's not burning out too soon." Richard, on the other hand, pushed Lightning to keep a more aggressive pace, clearly trying to wear out the other riders. Matthew noticed the strategy and trusted Hope's instinct to maintain her own rhythm. When they reached the first turn, Richard made a risky move, cutting sharply in front of Hope. Matthew had to pull the reins abruptly to avoid a collision. "Watch out!" shouted the announcer. "A dangerous move by Richard Parker." "That was on purpose," Old Joe muttered to Helen. He nearly knocked the boy off. Richard's maneuver had worked partially. Hope and Matthew lost a few positions and were now in 5th place. But the mare didn't seem shaken by the incident, keeping her full focus on the path ahead. The second part of the circuit went through a forest trail, where the horses ran single file due to the narrow path. It was the most technical part of the race, demanding precision and care from the riders. Richard led, followed by 2 experienced local riders. Hope and Matthew were in 4th place, well positioned for a move in the second lap. "How are you feeling?" Matthew asked Hope, knowing she couldn't answer but feeling the conversation kept them connected. The mare responded with a subtle increase in pace, as if to say she was just warming up. As they exited the forest trail, the course opened up again into wide fields. This was where Hope could use her experience and speed to regain lost ground. "Now's our time," Matthew said, giving the command to accelerate. Hope responded instantly, bursting forward at a speed that left everyone speechless. In less than 500 meters, she had overtaken the 2 riders ahead and was once again challenging Richard for the lead. "Unbelievable!" shouted the announcer. "Hope is flying. It's like the years haven't touched her." The crowd was ecstatic. People who had known the mare in her prime wept with emotion, seeing her run with such grace and speed. Richard realized he was losing ground and decided to implement the second part of his sabotage plan. As they approached an area with loose stones on the path, he deliberately made Lightning kick dirt and small rocks backward toward Hope. One of the stones hit Hope on the chest, startling her momentarily. Matthew felt the mare falter but managed to keep control. "It's okay," he said, trying to calm Hope. "Just a rock. Let's keep going." But the incident had broken the mare's rhythm. By the time they completed the first lap, they were in 3rd place, behind Richard and a rider named John Charles. "Second lap," announced the announcer. "Richard Parker holds the lead, followed by John Charles. Hope and young Matthew Johnson are in 3rd place, but still with a real chance of victory." Matthew could feel that Hope was starting to show signs of fatigue. After all, she was 23 years old and hadn't competed in over a decade. But there was something in her determination that made him believe she still had more to give. "Come on, girl," he whispered. "My grandma is watching. Let's show her that the Johnsons never give up." As if the words had awakened something deep in her memory, Hope pricked her ears slightly and sped up again. It was as if she was remembering all the races she had won with Grace, all the glory and excitement they had shared. At the entrance to the forest trail for the second time, Hope made a masterful outside pass, overtaking John Charles with an elegance that drew gasps from the crowd. "We're in 2nd place," Matthew shouted, feeling a wave of euphoria. Now it was just him and Hope against Richard and Lightning. Less than a kilometre from the finish line, the race had become an epic duel between the inexperienced young rider on a legendary mare and the professional jockey on his champion horse. Richard looked back and saw Hope closing in fast. Panic began to take hold of him. He couldn't lose this race, especially not to the son of the man his father had wronged years ago. When they emerged from the forest trail for the last time, just 800 meters from the finish, Richard made a desperate decision. He steered Lightning slightly to the right, trying to block Hope's path. It was an illegal and dangerous move, but Richard was willing to risk it all to maintain his supremacy. Matthew saw the move coming and had to make a quick choice. He could try to force his way through and risk a crash, or he could try to go around the outside, losing precious time. "What do you think, Hope?" he asked the mare. As if she understood perfectly, Hope chose a third option. Instead of trying to go around or force her way through, she simply accelerated even more, passing Richard by such a narrow margin that the two horses were practically side by side. "Neck and neck," shouted the announcer. Hope and Lightning are neck and neck with 500 meters to go. The crowd was hysterical. People screamed, jumped, and cried all at once. It was a race for the ages, an epic battle between past and present, between youthful determination and seasoned experience. Desperate, Richard tried one last sabotage. Pretending his whip had slipped from his hand, he dropped it right in front of Hope's hooves. The mare saw the object falling and instinctively leaped to avoid it. For a terrible moment, Matthew thought she would stumble and they'd both fall. But Hope was a champion, and champions find a way to win even in the toughest situations. She used the jump to propel herself even farther forward, as if the obstacle had served as a launching ramp. "Unbelievable," shouted the announcer. Hope turned an obstacle into an advantage. With 300 meters to go, Hope had taken a clear lead over Lightning. Richard whipped his horse desperately, but the animal was already giving its all. Matthew, on the other hand, barely needed to guide Hope. The mare seemed to know exactly where the finish line was and raced toward it with a determination that moved everyone watching. 200 meters, shouted the announcer. Hope in the lead. Richard makes a desperate attempt to recover. Then the unexpected happened. Lightning, pushed beyond his limits by Richard, began to limp. The horse had injured himself, likely due to the excessive strain and risky maneuvers of his rider. Richard had to drastically reduce his speed to avoid further injuring his horse. The race was lost, but worse than that, he had hurt the animal that trusted him. Hope and Matthew crossed the finish line with a lead of over 10 meters, sparking the most intense explosion of joy St. Peter Stables had witnessed in decades. "Winners!" shouted the announcer. "Hope and Matthew Johnson are the champions of the charity race, a historic victory for a legendary duo." Matthew could hardly believe what had happened. They had won. They now had the money for his grandmother's surgery. But more than that, they had proven that determination and heart could overcome experience and even sabotage. Hope was panting but radiant, her ears perked up and her eyes shining with a satisfaction she hadn't felt in years. It was as if she had remembered why she was born to run. The crowd flooded the track to congratulate the winners. Mrs. Edith came running, tears streaming down her face. "She's back," she cried. "My girl is a champion again." Helen approached with the prize check and a beaming smile. "Congratulations, Matthew. You both deserved this win." "Thank you," Matthew replied, still not fully believing it. "I couldn't have done it without Hope." But the celebration was interrupted by commotion near the finish line. Richard had dismounted from Lightning and was examining the horse's hoof with a look of despair. "He's limping badly," said the vet who had rushed to examine the animal. "He'll need treatment and rest." Richard was clearly shaken. For the first time, the consequences of his actions had fallen on someone he truly loved, his horse. Matthew, seeing the situation, dismounted from Hope and approached. "How is he?" he asked, genuinely concerned. Richard looked at him in surprise. "Why do you care? You won." "Because Lightning isn't to blame for the choices you made. He's a magnificent horse." The response left Richard speechless. Here was the young man he had repeatedly sabotaged, offering compassion in his moment of defeat. The vet finished the examination. "It's nothing serious. With a few days of rest and proper treatment, he'll be fine." The relief on Richard's face was evident. "Thank you," he said to the vet. Then, looking at Matthew, he added quietly, "And thank you for caring." Helen approached the group, her expression serious. "Richard, we need to talk." Several people reported irregularities during the race. Richard lowered his head. He knew the moment of truth had come. "You're right, I did things I shouldn't have." "Why?" Helen asked, clearly hurt. "Because I was afraid. Afraid of losing. Afraid of not being the best anymore. Afraid of not being worthy of you." The public confession left everyone in silence. Richard, the arrogant and confident jockey, was exposing his vulnerabilities for all to see. "My father taught me that winning was everything," he continued, "that it didn't matter how, as long as you came in first. But today I realized I was wrong. I hurt Lightning because of my obsession with winning. Matthew stepped forward. I know about my father, he said calmly. I know what Robert Parker did to him. Richard paled. You know, my grandmother told me about the sabotage, the accident, everything. I'm sorry. Things weren't supposed to happen that way. Were you there when my father got hurt? Richard hesitated, clearly wrestling with a painful memory. I was 14. My father took me to the stables that night, said he was going to teach a lesson to someone who was threatening our family. The crowd leaned in, everyone eager to hear the confession unfolding. When your father confronted mine, I saw the whole argument. My father was drunk, nervous. When your father fell off the horse, it really was an accident, but my father could have helped. Instead, he ran away and made me promise never to tell anyone. Tears began streaming down Richard's face. I've carried this guilt for 18 years, and when you showed up wanting to join the race, all the fear and shame came back. I didn't want you to find out the truth, so I tried to make you quit. Matthew felt a mix of complex emotions. Anger for what had been done to his family, but also compassion for a man who had carried the weight of a terrible secret for so long. Where's Robert now? He asked. Oh, he passed away 5 years ago. He took the secret to the grave, but I could never forget. Helen, who had heard the entire confession, stepped closer to Richard with tears in her eyes. How could you hide this from me all this time? Because I was afraid of losing you too. You're the only good thing in my life, Helen. I couldn't risk losing you because of my father's mistakes. Your father's mistakes, she said, her voice trembling. Richard, you sabotaged Matthew's training. You nearly caused accidents today during the race. Those are your mistakes, not your father's. The truth of Helen's words hit Richard like a punch. He had become exactly what he hated most about his father. You're right, he said, his voice breaking. I've become just like him. Matthew looked at Richard and made a decision that surprised everyone. No, he said firmly, you're not like your father. How can you say that after everything I've done? Because your father never admitted what he did, never apologized, never showed remorse. You just did all three in front of 300 people. The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sounds of horses neighing and the wind rustling through the fields. This doesn't change what I did, Richard said. It doesn't, but it changes what you can do from now on. Helen watched the interaction between the two men, seeing for the first time the true nature of both. Richard, vulnerable and remorseful. Matthew, mature and compassionate beyond his years. What happens now? She asked, to no one in particular. Dr. Taylor, who had witnessed the entire confession, stepped closer to the group. Officially, Richard will be disqualified from the race. The illegal maneuvers were witnessed by several people. I accept the disqualification, Richard said, and I resign as the official jockey of St. Peter's Stables. You don't have to do that, Helen protested. I do. I need to find a way to make amends, and I can't do that by acting like nothing happened. Matthew looked at Hope, who had watched the entire discussion with her intelligent eyes. The mare walked up to Richard and, to everyone's surprise, nuzzled his arm. She forgives you, Matthew said. Maybe it's time you forgive yourself. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. Richard's confession had completely changed the atmosphere of the celebration. People began dispersing, murmuring in small groups about what they had witnessed. Helen stepped away from Richard, clearly needing time to process everything she had learned. I think you should go home, she told him. We both need time to think about all this. Richard nodded, understanding he had lost more than a race that day. Helen, Not now, Richard. Please. He turned to Matthew one last time. I hope your Grandma Grace gets better. And thank you for not hating me. Hate only hurts the one who hates, Matthew replied. My grandmother taught me that. After Richard left, carefully leading Lightning into the trailer, the atmosphere grew lighter again. Matthew could finally process what had happened. "We won, Hope," he said to the mare, stroking her neck. "We got the money for Grandma's surgery." Mrs. Edith approached, still emotional. "Your grandmother would be so proud, not just for the win, but for how you handled the whole situation. She taught me that the real victory isn't coming in first, but doing the right thing." Helen joined the group, holding the prize check. $50,000, she said, handing the paper to Matthew. "Enough for your grandmother's surgery, with some left over." Matthew looked at the check with tears in his eyes. After weeks of struggle and uncertainty, he finally had the solution in his hands. "Thank you," he told Helen. "Thank you for believing in me. You and Hope earned every penny. That was one of the most thrilling races I've ever seen." Old Joe walked over, carrying a blanket for Hope. "This girl deserves a bath and some well-earned rest," he said, carefully covering the mare. "Will she be okay?" asked Matthew, worried about the effort Hope had put in. "She will. She's tired, but happy. Look at her eyes." It was true. Hope looked exhausted, but there was deep satisfaction in her expression. It was as if she'd fulfilled an important mission. "I'll take her back to the farm this afternoon," said Mrs. Edith. "She deserves to go home a hero." "Can I visit her any time?" asked Matthew. "Of course. You two make quite the pair." The rest of the morning flew by, with Matthew giving interviews to local reporters and receiving congratulations from dozens of people. But his mind was focused on one thing: getting to the hospital to share the good news with his grandmother. At 2 in the afternoon, he finally managed to leave and headed to the hospital. He found Grandma Grace awake and eager in her room. "How was the race, my boy?" she asked as soon as he walked in. "We won, Grandma," said Matthew, unable to contain his emotion. "Hope was amazing. She ran like in the old days." Grandma Grace's eyes filled with tears. "She won? My girl won?" "She did. And that's not all. We found out the truth about what happened to my father." Matthew told his grandmother the whole story, from Richard's sabotage to his public confession after the race. "So Robert was really behind it all," murmured Grandma Grace. "I always knew, but I could never prove it. And Richard carried that guilt for 18 years. I think that explains a lot about his behavior." "And how do you feel knowing the truth?" Matthew thought for a moment. "Relieved, honestly, knowing it wasn't really an accident, but also that it wasn't intentional. And seeing Richard make amends, I think it gave me peace. You're a good man, Matthew. Your father would be proud. And you, Grandma, how are you feeling?" "Better than I have in weeks. Knowing we can do the surgery, that Hope ran again, that the truth finally came out. It's like a weight's been lifted off my shoulders." Grandma Grace's doctor came in to check her vitals. "How's our patient today?" he asked, immediately noticing her improved mood. "Much better, doctor. My grandson got the money for the surgery." "That's wonderful news. We can schedule the procedure for next week then." Matthew felt a wave of relief hearing the surgery would finally happen. In the days that followed, the story of the race spread throughout the region. Local papers ran articles about Hope's victory and Richard's dramatic confession. The jockey had kept his word and resigned from his position at the stables. No one knew exactly what he was doing, but rumors said he had left town. Helen had temporarily taken over the responsibilities that once belonged to Richard, though it was clear she was still processing everything she had discovered about the man she had planned to marry. Matthew returned to work at his uncle's shop, but now with a renewed purpose. The leftover prize money would be used to help his mother expand the small sewing business she ran from home. Hope had returned to Mrs. Edith's farm, where she lived like a retired queen. Matthew visited her every weekend, and they took peaceful rides through the fields, free from the pressure of competition. Grandma Grace's surgery was a complete success. The doctors were surprised by how quickly she recovered, which they credited to her positive emotional state. "It's amazing how happiness can speed up healing," the surgeon remarked to Matthew after the procedure. A week later, Grandma Grace was discharged and able to return home. Matthew organized a small welcome party, inviting everyone who had helped during the difficult journey. Helen was among the guests, and Matthew noticed she seemed lighter, as if she had made peace with recent events. "How are you?" he asked her during the party. "Better. It was painful to learn that the person I loved wasn't who I thought he was, but it was also freeing. Have you heard anything from Richard? I have. He moved to a smaller town, about 100 miles from here. He's working on a farm, taking care of rescued horses. Rescued horses? Animals that were mistreated or abandoned. Seems he found a way to make amends by caring for those who need it most. Matthew smiled at that. That's good. I hope he finds the peace he was searching for. And you, Helen asked, what do you plan to do now? Keep working at the shop, take care of my grandmother, visit Hope. A simple life, but a full one. You don't think about competing again? After such an impressive win? Matthew shook his head. No, that race was special because it had a bigger purpose. Hope and I did what we needed to do. Now, she deserves to rest, and I have other responsibilities. The party lasted late into the night, with stories being shared and laughter filling the house that had been so quiet during Grandma Grace's illness. When everyone had left, Matthew sat beside his grandmother on the porch. Thank you, Grandma, he said. For what? For telling me about Hope. For giving me the chance to learn the truth about my father. For teaching me that real strength doesn't come from muscles, but from the heart. Grandma Grace held her grandson's hand. You always had that strength, Matthew. You just needed an opportunity to show it. They sat in silence for a few minutes, watching the stars in the clear sky. You know what makes me happiest in all of this? Grandma Grace asked. What? Seeing that you didn't hold a grudge against Richard. Your father would be proud to know his son chose forgiveness over revenge. You taught me that carrying anger is like carrying a stone in your heart. After a while, the stone gets so heavy you can't even walk. Exactly. And now you're free to move forward. 3 months later, Matthew was visiting Hope when he got an unexpected call. It was Helen. Matthew, can you come to the stables today? There's someone here who wants to talk to you. Who is it? You'd better come see. Curious, Matthew said goodbye to Hope and drove to St. Peter's stables. When he arrived, he found Helen waiting for him at the entrance. Who wanted to talk to me? He asked. They're in the main stable. They walked over there, and Matthew was surprised to see Richard brushing a young horse. The former jockey was thinner, his skin tanned by the sun, and there was something different in his eyes, a peace that hadn't been there before. Hi, Matthew, said Richard, lifting his head. Thanks for coming. Richard, what are you doing here? I came to return something that wasn't mine. Richard stepped away from the young horse and motioned for Matthew to come closer. This is Courage, Lightning's foal. He was born last month. He's beautiful, said Matthew, admiring the colt. He's yours. What do you mean, mine? Lightning recovered completely from his injury. In fact, he came back even stronger. And when Courage was born, I knew right away he should stay with you. Matthew looked at Richard, confused. I don't understand. All these months working with rescued horses taught me a lot about redemption, about how sometimes the best way to fix a mistake is to turn it into something good. Richard moved closer to Courage and stroked his neck. This colt has his father's champion blood, but he's got something else too. The potential to be raised with love instead of obsession, to be trained with patience instead of aggression. Richard, I can't accept this. Yes, you can. It's my way of honoring your father's memory and truly asking for forgiveness. Helen approached the group. Richard came back here specifically to give you Courage. He refused any payment for him. Matthew looked at the colt, who watched him with curious, intelligent eyes. There was something familiar in that gaze, a spark that reminded him of Hope. Are you sure? He asked Richard. Absolutely. Besides, I'd like to make you an offer. What kind of offer? Helen and I are planning to turn part of the stables into an equine therapy center for children who've been through trauma. We'd like you to be our lead instructor. The offer left Matthew speechless. But I'm not an instructor. I barely know how to ride. You know the most important thing, said Helen. You know how to connect with horses in a special way, and you know what it's like to overcome hardship. It would be a paid position, Richard added. You could leave the workshop and dedicate yourself fully to the horses. Matthew looked at Courage again, then at Richard and Helen. You two, are you back together? Helen and Richard exchanged a glance. "We're trying to rebuild our relationship," said Helen, "based on honesty this time. Working with rescued horses changed me," Richard explained. "Taught me that caring matters more than controlling. Helen's giving me a second chance to prove I've really changed. And I'm learning to trust again," Helen added. Matthew thought about the offer. Working with horses and helping children who'd been through tough times, it was an opportunity he'd never imagined. "Can I talk to my grandma before deciding?" "Of course," said Helen, "but you already have our answer about Courage. He's yours whether you take the job or not." That night, Matthew told Grandma Grace about the offer. "What do you think, Grandma?" "I think it's destiny calling you, my boy. You've always had a special gift with animals. When you were little, even the meanest neighborhood dogs would calm down around you. But leaving Uncle's workshop, your uncle will understand. He always knew you had other dreams. And working with Richard, after everything that happened, sometimes the best partnerships come from the biggest conflicts. If he's really changed, you two could do amazing work together." Matthew spent the whole night thinking about his decision. The next morning he called Helen. "I accept," he said. "I accept the job, and I accept Courage." "That's wonderful," Helen exclaimed. "We're going to do something truly special here." 6 months later, the St. Peter Equine Therapy Center was running at full speed. Matthew had proven to be a natural instructor, able to connect traumatized children with gentle horses in a way that even surprised the team's psychologists. Richard worked primarily with training and caring for the horses, applying everything he had learned about patience and compassion. The partnership between the two men had grown into a solid friendship, built on mutual respect and shared goals. Courage had grown into an exceptional horse, not for speed or aggression, but for his kindness and intelligence. He seemed to instinctively understand when a child needed comfort or encouragement. Hope, now 24 years old, had become the unofficial ambassador of the center. Mrs. Edith brought her once a week for special sessions, where the legendary mare helped children who had lost hope find the will to fight again. "It's like she knows exactly what to do," one of the psychologists remarked after watching Hope interact with a girl who hadn't spoken for months due to trauma. "Hope has always been special," Matthew replied. "She understands pain because she's felt pain, and she understands overcoming because she's overcome." Grandma Grace, fully recovered from her surgery, had become a volunteer at the center, telling children stories about horses and riders and helping with recreational activities. "I never thought at 65 I'd be starting a new career," she joked with Matthew. "Life always has surprises for those willing to accept new adventures," he replied. Helen had officially taken over the stables, turning them into a regional reference for equine therapy. Her relationship with Richard had grown stronger through their shared work, now based on shared values rather than just attraction. "Are you two getting married again?" Matthew asked Helen one day as they organized a demonstration for visitors. "Maybe," she said, smiling. "But this time it'll be because we chose to build something together, not because we're afraid of being alone." The story of Matthew, Hope, and Richard had spread far beyond Greenfield. Journalists from big cities came to report on the center, and universities sent students to observe the equine therapy methods developed by the team. But for Matthew, the most important moments were the small ones. Seeing a child smile for the first time in months, watching Courage show endless patience with an autistic boy, feeling Hope nuzzle the hand of a girl who had lost her parents. "You know the best part of all this?" Matthew asked Richard one afternoon as they watched the children interact with the horses. "What?" "Seeing how pain can be turned into healing, how our worst moments can become the foundation for our best work." Richard nodded, understanding perfectly. "Your grandmother was right that day. Holding on to anger is like carrying a stone in your heart, but turning that anger into compassion, that's freeing." That evening, as he did every Friday, Matthew visited Hope at Mrs. Edith's farm. The mare, slower now but still majestic, greeted him with her familiar whinny. "Hey girl," he said, stroking her neck. "How was your week?" Hope tilted her head as she always did when he spoke to her. "You know, sometimes I still can't believe everything that's happened. If someone had told me a year ago that I'd be here doing this work, living this life, I'd have thought it was impossible. He leaned against the mare's warm neck, feeling the peace he always found in her presence. "Thank you for everything, Hope. For teaching me that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's being afraid and doing the right thing anyway." The mare snorted softly, as if responding. "And thank you for showing me it's never too late for a second chance, or a third, or as many as it takes." Matthew stayed there a few more minutes, watching the sunset over the fields where Hope had run her first races decades ago. When he finally said goodbye and headed home, he found his grandmother on the porch, knitting and humming an old tune. "How's our girl?" Grandma Grace asked. "Good. Always good. I think she's found her true calling, helping the kids. Just like you." "Yeah, just like me." They sat together on the porch, watching the stars appear in the sky. "You know what makes me happiest about all this?" Grandma Grace asked. "What, Grandma?" "Seeing that we chose the right path. Forgiveness instead of revenge. Building instead of tearing down. Love instead of hate. You're the one who taught me that." "No, my grandson. It was already inside you. I just helped you find it." Matthew smiled, feeling deep gratitude for everything that had happened. The hard times, the victories, the losses, the reconciliations, all of it had led to this moment of peace and purpose. "What a story, huh, Grandma?" he said. "What a story," Grandma Grace agreed. "And the best part? It's still being written." The end of the story. What an incredible journey we've shared. Matthew, Hope, and Richard showed us that true victory isn't about finishing first. It's about finding redemption, forgiveness, and purpose. Now tell us, do you think Richard deserved a second chance? And what did you think of Matthew's transformation from an inexperienced young man to an equine therapist? Leave your honest thoughts below, and don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel.